Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Trauma Camp for Teachers podcast. I'm your host, Julia Rose Polk, trauma therapist, trainer, and educator about creating trauma-informed teachers and trauma-informed schools. Welcome. In today's episode, we're talking about that invisible thing that keeps you up at night, makes your hair turn gray, ages us prematurely, and even in some cases can lead us to an early death. We're talking about stress. And in the world of traumatology, with the advent of this idea of toxic stress, stress overall has gotten a really bad rap. And it's actually not an accurate take of what stress is. There are different kinds of stress, and each of those kinds of stress produces different outcomes. And so in today's episode, I'll be walking you through the 3 types of stress and the one you definitely need to look out for. Here we go. So the first kind of stress is what we call positive stress. Positive stress is the good kind of stress. It's manageable, predictable, it's not overwhelming. It's also contained by loving, supportive relationships that can help us hold that stress. I want you to think about the stress before a big game, or that stress you feel right before you're about to go out onto a stage or give a big presentation. So in 2010, I was actually in this pageant called the Rose of Tralee, which is for women around the world of the Irish diaspora. So you don't have to be born in Ireland. I certainly wasn't, but I sure as heck come from Irish folks. And I was in this pageant and I was about to go out on stage, and it's what makes the Rose of Tralee pageant a little different from other pageants is it's kind of a personality pageant. It's not, there's no bikinis and hello, and you do get to wear a gorgeous gown, but you are there being interviewed and understood from the basis of who you are as a person. And so I was in this pageant and I was on deck ready to be called out, and I was nervous AF. I'd never been in a pageant. My friends were there, my mom had flown out. There were a bunch of strangers in the audience. It was at the Irish American Heritage Center in Chicago. And my nerves were getting the best of me. And I had just recently learned about Peter Levine's work with healing trauma through his modality of somatic experiencing. And I'm not gonna go into that now, but basically it is a way of attending to the body where you can relieve stress from the body. And I remember hearing him talking about if you watch ducks at a pond, after they get in a fight, they will turn away and they will shake it out. And you'll see them do this. This is me shaking it out. But they'll shake it out. They'll actually get the energy, that trapped energy moving through their body, and they'll let it go. And so what I did, I'm here looking done up. My hair is done, my face is done. I'm in this gorgeous black and white gown that I still have, hey. And I squatted on the ground and I just started shaking. And I was using it as a conscious tool for trying to relieve my body of stress. So I was just shaking, taking deep breaths. And then when they called my name, I stood up and I walked out. And I actually won the 2010 Chicago Rose of Tralee. Thank you. Thank you. But all of that is to say that this is an example of positive stress, right? And actually working with positive stress. Positive stress is there intending to help us generate, create, build, engage. And all of these things can be stressful. And that kind of stress is really important to helping us develop and grow. It's helpful in teaching us what we are made of, right? It's the stress required for taking risks, meaningful risks, productive risks. It's that stress required for growth. And without it, humans stay stuck at whatever level they're in. So positive stress is deeply, deeply important. And so shout out to positive stress. You are welcome here. But the core features of that, and I talked about this in the recent vulnerability versus resilience episode, is positive stress, again, is manageable, it's predictable, and it's buffered by loving and safe adult relationships. So positive stress is like a green light. It means go, we want more, we welcome it. Yes. The second kind of stress is more like a yellow light, and this is called tolerable stress. It is more serious in nature. It kind of like brings us to the edges of what feels tolerable. So this can be caused by anything like a natural disaster, a death in the family, a period of instability. All of this is stressful, right? So it's generating more stress than a human being can handle alone. But what makes it tolerable are two things. One, it is temporary. So it's for a period of time before returning to a state of normal or calm. And it is buffered by safe and loving relationships. When we are held by people who love us and care for us and pour that love and care into us, it is amazing what we are capable of tolerating and getting through and moving through. The thing with tolerable stress is that just because it's tolerable doesn't mean that it's what we want to learn to tolerate, right? Again, if it goes from temporary to chronic, it's not tolerable stress anymore. It would send us into the third kind of stress, which I'll get to in a second. But tolerable stress is really important for people to know because it's like, it happens. Being a human, you are going to encounter some degree of tolerable stress at any given point, or stress that would meet the criteria of tolerable stress. And what's really important with tolerable stress is how we navigate our way through it, right? Not only do we have these loving, safe, supportive relationships around us to help us be carried through this stressful experience, but we also are talking about it in a way of how we did the hard thing, how we got through that challenge together, what tools we employed, what strategies we used to navigate that critical or crisis situation. This is especially important in examples like natural disasters, where there's just huge physical devastation. Everyone's been affected, and how valuable it is to come together and point out and look at the ways of how each group or each individual has come together with resilience, really. Like, how have we shown up to take care of ourselves or our community in that moment? And that might be showing up to clean up debris on the school grounds after a big storm. That could be, the potluck committee chipping in and making sure people are fed for the next couple of days. It could be recognizing how the little 5-year-old went and hid in a closet to take care of themselves and to protect themselves when they were scared. What we're doing there is we are highlighting the ways that humans are inherently resilient and showing up to navigate a scary problem. And the third and final form of stress that we want to look at, which would be a red light stress, is toxic stress. And the nature of toxic stress is that it is happening for a prolonged period of time, and it is absent of those loving and supportive relationships that would help otherwise buffer us from that experience. So any kind of situation where there is any form of abuse, neglect, family dysfunction, if you have parents or caregivers with untreated mental illness, if you have friends or family members or caregivers who are dealing with untreated addiction, anything that compromises the human relationship starts to err into the realm of toxic stress. And it is especially so if it is not a single event, but one that is either chronic or a prolonged situation. In essence, when the people a child relies upon are either the ones causing harm or are simply not available to provide the needed support, both of those enter the territory of toxic stress. And toxic stress over time is what leads to really devastating outcomes. So the more toxic stress you experience as a child, the higher likelihood that you will also experience negative outcomes in physical health, mental health, social health, employment health. That's a term that I'm coining right now. But essentially, people who've experienced toxic stress have a harder time at jobs and have a harder time showing up to work. Okay, so now let's look at this through the lens of how these different types of stress, positive, tolerable, and toxic, impact and affect children. So a child who's experienced positive stress is likely to have an outlook on life and challenges that come their way as something we can work through, something we can figure out. As Marie Forleo says, everything is figure outable, right? That is a philosophy that comes from a place of positive stress being something that generates meaningful and impactful change in my life or in someone else's life. A child who's experienced tolerable stress will likely have a worldview or response to stressors that is varied. For example, if a child just went through a house fire, their response to minor stressors in the short term are probably going to be high, right? They have very low capacity for tolerating what might feel like normal stressors to anybody else. But a year later, after they've worked through that and navigated it and returned to feeling supported and contained by their community, that child's ability to respond to what we might consider normal stressors again will start to improve, and they will likely be able to take challenges head on like they once were before the fire, right? So that's the difference with tolerable stress, is it's going to be varied based on how close it is to the actual event and what kind of supports they got in navigating that tolerable stress. Now, a child exposed to toxic stress is going to have a very different experience than the first two. Because their stress system is so activated, they are likely going to have big responses to even minor stressors because their system is oriented to perceiving it all as a threat. So they're going to get hijacked into a state of stress arousal very easily and very simply. For students who've experienced toxic stress like this, it makes it harder for them to show up to the daily tasks of living with a regulated nervous system. Their baseline is thrown off and sent into a hyper-aroused state or a hypo-aroused, depending on if they go into fight and flight or freeze and fawn. And because of that, it makes it very difficult for them to often tend to the minor social or academic or interpersonal stressors that come with being in a classroom or being on a playground or being in a school. So understanding these nuances of stress and these three different types of stress really is here to help you start to understand the children you're working with, and I might even say your colleagues and bosses, a little better, right? You're starting to understand how much stress can the student work with before they are someone I can't work with anymore, right? And that gets to determine how you show up to that relationship. Recognizing the types of stress that a student has experienced, whether they're used to positive stress, tolerable stress, or toxic stress, helps us tailor our work with them and orient to those needs of creating safety first by understanding their stress response system. So I hope that's helpful, that we covered these three different types of stress today. Please let me know if you found this podcast valuable. If so, rate and review this episode, and I can't wait to hear how it's landing for all of you. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.